would like to begin by acknowledging country and the traditional owners of the unceded lands and waters on which we live and work. I pay my respect to the elders, past and present, and I pay my respect in particular to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who are the custodians of the lands on which I have the honor to live. So a warm welcome to everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Annick Thomasin. I'm a researcher at CAEPR, and I'll be your host for the next hour and a half. Today's seminar is titled Guiding Principle for a New Livelihood and Work Program in Remote Indigenous Australia. This is the second of a series of 2 seminars which focus on the now different community development program. If you missed last week's seminar, you can now access the recording in the past events section of the CAEPR website. So our presenters today in order of appearance are Dr. Zoe Staines from the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland, and from the ANU, Dr. Elise Klein from the Crawford School of Public Policy, Dr. Francis Markham from CAEPR, and Emeritus Professor John Altman from the School of Regulation and Global Governance. Before I pass the floor to Zoe, just a brief reminder that the seminar is being recorded with the exception of the Q&A period. Please make sure that your microphones and cameras are turned off during the presentation, and the panelists will take questions after the 4 of them have finished their presentations. So Zoe, over to you.
Thanks, Annick. I'll just share my screen. So good morning and good afternoon. Good morning for me, good afternoon to I think most of you who are joining us from down south. It's great to have you all here today to continue our discussion on the Community Development Program and indeed what comes after the Community Development Program now that it is coming to an end, as Annick just pointed out. I want to start by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that I'm currently sitting on, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples up here in the centre of Brisbane. And I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I want to also acknowledge and pay respects to the various different unceded lands that each of us are joining from here today as well. Thank you to CAEPR again for hosting us again this to present to our seminar from a couple of weeks ago. As I'll talk about in a minute, that seminar was a bit of a retrospective. We looked back on the lessons of CDP, while today we're going to take a little bit of a different approach and start looking forward at what possibly might come next, hence the kind of sun on the first slide, you know, looking into the horizon, maybe something like that. So I want to start by briefly giving a bit of background on the journey that we've been on with this project during 2021. So in about April, the 4 of us presenting today got into contact with each other to discuss our sort of desire to bring together the evidence base around CDP. CDP obviously being the Welfare to Work or Workfare program that has operated in remote Australia since 2015 and which has a caseload of around 40,000 at the moment, of whom about 80% are Indigenous people. So a lot has happened with a lot had happened with CDP in 2020, including the suspension of mutual obligations under the program in response to COVID. And there was a great deal of ongoing talk about the possibility of changing to a different policy approach in remote Australia. Certainly some proposals started to come to the fore. So we convened a workshop at ANU in July in 2021, where we were joined by 4 other scholars with an incredible amount of experience and background, not only researching CDP, but also its predecessor, CDEP. And those 4 scholars were Lisa Folkes, Will Sanders, Michael Dillon, and John Quiggin, who graced us with their wisdom and their knowledge. So we're grateful to them for that. So from that workshop, the 4 of us speaking today authored a report which was published by the Australia Institute in August 2021, and I've just shared the link to that report in our chat if you want to access that. The report canvasses the evidence arising from CDP with a view to putting that evidence to use to guide future approaches, to start thinking about what comes after. In the report, we set out a series of 7 principles which are rooted in this evidence base and which are intended to guide future policy making away from a repeat of the many harms that were seen and have been seen under CDP, which was the topic of our first seminar a couple of weeks ago. While we were going on this journey, there was also a great deal of movement going on in terms of the CDP policy journey. So in May this year, Minister Wyatt made an announcement in the budget that CDP would be wound up in 2023 and that a new program would be co-designed in the meantime to replace it. This would start with 4 pilots across Australia, supposed to begin late this year. In September, an amendment to the Social Security Act was introduced into Parliament, which would set up the remote engagement program, the REP, and the first Senate report on this REP bill was released just this week, and John will talk to that a little bit later. So things are moving quickly as we see the policy cogs continuing to turn in this space. Though, as John will also speak to later, these changes so far don't necessarily inspire a great deal of hope just yet. So where are we going today? To follow on from John's introduction a couple of weeks ago, this seminar is part 2 of a 2-play act. For our last seminar, we started by looking at the past, as I've said, reflecting on CDP as a means to set the foundation for envisioning a better future. That first act had 4 brief scenes, which involved looking at the many and considerable harms caused by CDP, as well as the broader punitive context within which CDP operates. Today, we're taking a different direction and looking to the future at how the lessons that have arisen from the experience of CDP might guide policy making in a post-CDP context. So today's presentation again has 4 brief scenes. First, I'll start by giving an overview of the evidence-based guiding principles we set out in our Australia Institute report, published in August. Elise will then elaborate on the importance of centering care work in any new policy or program, particularly for ensuring that work in all its forms is valued. Frances and John will then turn towards alternative proposals for a post-CDP environment, and we'll use our guiding principles as a lens through which to do a sort of preliminary assessment of these proposals. Frances will talk to the Fair Work Strong Communities proposal, the Livable Income Guarantee proposal, and a Job Guarantee proposal. And John will then look more closely at the Remote Engagement Program, including the bill itself, the Senate report, and the constraints that this is already creating for the supposed co-design that's meant to be happening as we move towards a sort of post-CDP context. So I'll get underway with my section. So I want to take a few minutes now to provide a bit of an overview of the guiding principles we outline in our Australia Institute report. These principles are grounded in evidence, but as we mentioned throughout the document, they are not intended to preempt the co-design process that is ongoing with Indigenous stakeholders. Instead, the principles are intended as sort of guardrails to avoid a repeat of the harms and the worst aspects of workfare programs like we've seen under CDP. Our starting point for articulating these principles was to acknowledge that work and employment are secondary to building a stable foundation that protects basic needs and well-being. So rather than undermining health and well-being, a future policy must seek to restore and nurture health and well-being as a matter of priority. It's only healthy and well people that can thrive and who can enjoy the kinds of benefits that work might also bring. So in respect of this, we separated these guiding principles into 2 layers, which you can see in the pyramid here. So where principles 1, 2, and 5 primarily work to establish this strong foundation, and where principles 3, 4, 6, and 7 build on that foundation by supporting locally valued forms of work. I'll go through these principles in the order that they appear in the pyramid here, starting with the bottom half of the pyramid and then moving to the top half. So principle 1 sets out that as a basic starting point, a revised policy must guarantee compatibility with Australia's obligations under international human rights instruments and domestic laws. This includes by avoiding racial discrimination, ensuring that Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination, as well as their rights to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions are protected. That's something that we haven't seen under CDP, as we talked to last week, which was discriminatory in the way that it imposed and imposes disproportionate mutual obligations on Indigenous peoples and oversaw incredibly high levels of breaching for Indigenous participants. A new policy must also uphold the right of everyone to social security and for the provision of just and favourable conditions of work, including fair wages and a decent living. This informs Principle 2, which is that a revised policy must ensure a stable economic floor to alleviate poverty. The kind of excessive breaching and loss of income seen under CDP has meant that basic needs have not been able to be met in many communities, including needs for food and shelter. To avoid this, we argue that a revised policy must ensure that people have access to a stable, unconditional economic floor that is sufficient to provide for basic needs. We argue that raising a guaranteed economic floor that is free of activity testing to an adequate rate would have the greatest impact on reducing endemic poverty. As a further means of ensuring a stable and supportive foundation, Principle 5 also draws attention to the need for greater support to be given to those who cannot work. Over the last decade, we've seen disability support pension become harder to access, particularly in remote areas, because we have the layered effects of poor service provision in remote areas. And thus people have been siphoned into CDP and other workfare programs instead, but these only serve to worsen health and wellbeing for many. It's also the case that access to services to support those who cannot work, such as under the NDIS, is often insufficient in remote communities, as I've just pointed to. Thus, access to basic support services must also form a part of ensuring a future policy caters and cares for those who can't work. Moving on to the top half of the pyramid, in terms of principles to support locally valued forms of work. So Principle 3 brings our attention back to the myth that has continued to animate recent workfare policies like CDP, and that's that the private sector will deliver sufficient waged employment to service all individuals who are looking for but cannot find employment, waged work. Despite decades worth of policies and interventions, though, this is not eventuated. So we suggest that alternatives are needed to ensure that all of those who wish to secure dignified, stable, and livable incomes through work can do so. This then leads into Principle 4, which suggests that to respond to Principle 3, there's a need to make suitable paid work available. It is true that there are health and wellbeing benefits that can flow from work, but these depend on the kind of work that people do and the level of agency that people have in choosing the kind of work that they do and how they do it. So whatever approach is taken to making work available, it needs to acknowledge that, we suggest, if activities do not align with people's aspirations, capabilities, and needs, then work will be unlikely to improve wellbeing. And also that there is already a great deal of productive work going on in remote communities that is currently unpaid and unrecognised, but which does make significant contributions to overall health and wellbeing. An example of this is critically important caring work, some of which is paid, but much of which is not. And Elise will speak to this principle in a minute and unpack that a little bit more. So Principle 6 argues that future policies must also be responsive to social fluidity. That is, they must respond to the fluid and dynamic nature of people's lives, rather than simply cutting them off when they step out of the bounds of program rules. Future policies should also enable local communities to tailor arrangements to meet local needs, which those communities are best placed to understand. Which brings me to Principle 7. Which suggests that future policies must properly support rather than disempower the Indigenous community-controlled sector. Rather than seeing Indigenous organisations being straitjacketed by top-down demands and rigid contracting arrangements, ICCOs, or Indigenous Community Controlled Organisations, should receive adequate and secure funding, and that includes longer term secure funding, and be able to operate within more flexible arrangements that enable them to self-determine local approaches to supporting work that is locally valued and locally valuable. We see these principles as operating holistically. They're designed to mutually support and reinforce each other in ways that might guide a future approach that can, firstly, build a stable economic floor, or build a stable floor to ensure basic needs are met while well-being can be improved. Guarantees that have been absent from recent approaches like CDP, and which properly financially support locally valued productive work for those who can engage in it. So in their entirety, the principles are designed to guide the development of a policy approach that can properly and belatedly address the reality of life in remote Indigenous communities, and which support individuals and families in these communities to first recover and then also flourish and thrive as well. We will talk a little bit more on centering care.
Thanks very much, Zoe. I also want to acknowledge that I'm here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we've tried to centre care into our principles. In developing these principles, we thought a lot about the tension that there being not enough jobs, but plenty of work around, and how government policy ideology has accused people of not being in work, but where the problem is structural and not behavioural. So as I talked a little bit about last seminar, this is a problem because it overlooks diverse forms of productivity and privileges only certain meanings of work and development, while passing off other work and people doing it as unproductive. There's a lot of work undertaken in remote and regional Australia, but it's often unseen and unpaid. And we've thought about this in terms of care. And so thinking about it in broad terms, the care of country, the important work, cultural work and ecological work on country, care of culture, the endurance about keeping culture strong in the face of the settler state, reviving and keeping language alive, connection, but also important practices such as food provisioning, but also care of people, caring of individuals, children, elderly, but also households and communities. Care of people is especially important given how uncaring and damaging government policies have been to people. In the last seminar, we outlined the damage done to communities, households and people during and under CDP, decrease of incomes, deepening poverty, reduction in health and wellbeing, hunger, disempowerment, and that's just CDP. There are many other policies that are causing harm in people's lives too. It is also crucial to note that all of this care work has significance not just to First Nations people, but to the Australian economy and society also. So First Nations care work is often expropriated by the settler economy, although the quantification of this needs more exploration. But we do know that the capitalist economy free rides on unpaid care labour at extraordinary rates. And looking at census data, First Nations people do more of it than non-First Nations people. But that's just care of people, and there's questions about how other forms of care work, such as caring of culture, which can be expropriated by, say, the tourism industry, care of country, and links with extractive and agricultural industries. I don't say all this to make the case that this work should be the utility of the settler economy, but as a direct challenge to narratives of First Nations unproductivity and dependency. And in my opinion, it also raises questions about the indebtedness to the settler economy that the settler economy has to First Nations work, and the principles that we have outlined, including an economic floor to protect people from destitution, really is the bare minimum of what is owed. And it would be great if policymakers carried some of this, some humility in this kind of thinking into their so-called co-design of future program. So in our paper, our collective thinking was, at the very least, for any future policies that it takes seriously, that if it takes seriously wanting to support people to work, then suitable work must be made available. We acknowledge that it will remain important to continue to create and support pathways into formal employment where these exist in remote Australia, and where people, particularly younger generations, choose to take it up. However, it is also necessary to ensure that future policies are designed recognising that pathways into private sector wage jobs will only be available to a small proportion of individuals who are experiencing unemployment in remote Australia, and definitely not everyone. Also, the diversity of people's aspirations should be supported and not foreclosed into very narrow government ideas of work. And so we suggest that the recognition and remuneration of the already diverse unwaged work that has been undertaken daily in remote Indigenous communities is needed. We can see this approach already. For example, the importance of caring for country has been recognised and supported under the Australian government's successful Indigenous Ranger program, which has created more than 2,100 full-time, part-time and casual jobs around the country since 2007. Rangers draw on their culturally informed environmental expertise and skills to protect country and seas. However, this is just one aspect of the rich and deep care practices. For example, caring for people demands much greater support. This is especially the case in remote Indigenous Australia, where there's legacies and trauma of colonisation and continued racism and woeful policy making that have impacted negatively on generations and have made mere survival a challenge. The symptoms of this trauma are widespread, and they include considerable negative health and wellbeing impacts, including highest rates of disability, suicide and severe illness in Australia. This translates into very high needs for care work in remote Australia, some of which is waged, for example, waged healthcare jobs, but most of which is unremunerated forms of care, such as caring for family and kin. There may be opportunities to formalise more of this work, as Zoe has said, through the NDIS, as people who have these plans are sometimes unable to have them serviced because of the inadequate availability of support services in remote and regional parts of Australia. This realisation has triggered additional funding to Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations to improve service delivery. However, these will likely only suit the needs, skills and aspirations of some carers, and thus future policy should continue to consider how caring for people might be more widely supported and valued in remote Australia. A replacement to CDP could take up this challenge, where through Indigenous community-controlled organisations, paid positions undertaking diverse forms of care with full employment rights could be offered. The point being, people in remote communities should not be disadvantaged because of the absence or shortage of wage jobs. There's much work already being done there's much work to be done and much already being done. But policies that involve narrow and constrained definitions of work simply ignores these diverse forms of labour, despite their critical importance to maintaining and supporting communities. Thanks. I think Francis now will jump in.
Thanks a lot, Elise. So I think from that outline of the principles and the origins really of this work, I'm going to pivot now to a bit of an application of those principles. And really what I'm looking to highlight is in this almost post-CDP world, that there's been a number of policies in circulation that look to provide alternatives to things like CDP, both ones that are specifically focused on remote Indigenous communities and others which are more broadly targeted. So what I'm looking to do today is really to apply those 7 principles that Zoe outlined to 3 of these proposals. The Fair Work, Stronger Communities proposal that was put forth by APONT in 2017, the Livable Income Guarantee proposal, which was put forward by group of academics, including Elise Klein in 2020, and the job guarantee proposal that's various versions of have been described by Noel Pearson, Bill Mitchell, and Michael Watts. So I'll describe each of these principles very briefly, and then assess them against the criteria of those 7 principles, which we've envisaged as guardrails, as Zoe put it. So the first of these, the Fair Work, Stronger Communities proposal, was prepared by APONT in May 2017, coinciding with the Senate inquiry into CDP. And they envisage a remote-focused program to replace the CDP, which has some continuities with CDP, but also many breaks. Institutionally, CDP providers in this proposal were to be transformed into remote job centres, and these remote job centres would provide paid part-time work for 10,500 individuals. This paid work would be facilitated by a standard employment contract and subject to the Fair Work Act, relevant health and safety legislation, the superannuation guarantee. And it would be intended for those who have a capacity to work but cannot find paid work in remote Australia. The jobs would be either directly employed, but job seekers would either be directly employed by the remote job centres themselves, or the fund which would facilitate these jobs would allow other Indigenous community organisations to apply for those funds. For those who fall outside the bounds of this scheme, bearing in mind that only around 10,000 places were intended, or around a third to a quarter of the current CDP caseload. For those people who are unemployed but do not take up a job as part of this scheme, it was envisaged that the mutual obligation requirements would be essentially mainstreamed to be no more onerous than those in non-remote areas, and really to kind of remove the most discriminatory aspects of the current CDP Work for the Dole programs, which have been put on pause in the last few months. Remote job centres were also to provide support for those who are unable to work, either to move into the disability support pension or to find avenues into work. And finally, a remote youth projects component to this proposal looked to provide young people with training and paid work experience in community projects. And if you could advance the slides, thanks. So as you might expect, this proposal really aligns with many of the principles that we outlined. The new jobs would be provided under employment contracts and thus would satisfy the non-discrimination requirement, and especially as mutual obligations would be equalised with those of job active. Where the scheme perhaps would fall short in some areas in our, according to our principles, is around the provision of a stable economic floor. The limited number of jobs available in this proposal means that there'll be many people who will remain in mainstream social security. And although the mutual obligations will be made less onerous, it means that many people would remain in poverty if this program was implemented as it was designed, although that poverty rate would be reduced as the costings undertaken by NATSEM of this proposal indicate. This proposal does avoid the myth that the private sector will deliver sufficient jobs, but it doesn't go all the way to providing jobs for all who would want to take them up. It does support in a limited way, those who are unable to work within the mainstream social security system. And it's unclear the extent to which it ensures a flexible response to social fluidity, as really discretion would be devolved to employers. Finally, it would provide strong support to the Indigenous community-controlled sector. The second of these proposals is the Livable Income Guarantee, described by John Quiggin, Elise, Klein and others. Now this proposal is a national proposal. It's not remote focused and it's not Indigenous focused. And its aim is to give everybody essentially the opportunity who wishes to participate in non-market activities and receive a livable income. It's based on the idea of participation income and the principle that everyone has a right to a livable income, to a minimum level of financial security and an opportunity to contribute to society. Essentially, this is a proposal that is focused on the social security system and would entail an overhaul of the social security system in a relatively radical way. It foresees the replacement of working age social security payments with this new livable income guarantee, which would be paid at the rate of the age pension, which is above the poverty line currently. This payment isn't a universal basic income in the sense that it would be income tested and age tested, and it would require a participation in an activity like child raising, study, volunteering, artistic and creative activities, or community and ecological care. But crucially, this activity requirement would be only weekly monitored through self-declarations in much the same way that the tax system is monitored through self-declarations, but subject to audit from the tax office should they decide to. Very different to the kind of ongoing and intensive surveillance provided by Centrelink and the social security system. Now, on top of this livable income guarantee, the proposal does countenance reparative payments to First Nations people on top of the LIG, and it also includes the suggestion of a capital fund which would support organisations to provide participation activities. Now, this is a very different type of proposal to the Fair Work Stronger Communities proposal, but you can see that it has a similar alignment with the set of principles we've outlined. It's, in terms of discrimination, it's a universal program and would actually include First Nations measures as a special measure. It would be very likely to effectively eliminate poverty in Australia, at least according to the sort of standard poverty rates, lines rather. It doesn't really seek to replace the private labour market and thus provide jobs, but instead it seeks to complement it and make sure that those who fall outside the private labour market aren't in poverty, and those who seek to secure a living beyond the market are able to do so. So in that sense, it somewhat makes suitable paid work available according to that principle, but it pays people for the work that they are electing to do, essentially. It, of course, therefore would be highly flexible, and through the capital fund, it might support the Indigenous community controlled sector, although there's not a great deal of detail with regards to that. A very different sort of proposal that's also national in scope has been described by Noel Pearson, Bill Mitchell and Michael Watts. It's a job guarantee proposal that they outlined in a series of papers in July 2020, series of op-eds rather, in July 2020 in the Australian newspaper, and then costed in a Centre for Full Employment and Equity, or COFFEE, paper in that same month. Now this proposal is nationally focused. Is intended to be universally available, and it views Indigenous unemployment as part of the larger problem of Australian unemployment, and seeks to deal with Indigenous underemployment by dealing with the problem as a whole rather than directly or head on. In this proposal, the Commonwealth Government would provide those who are unemployed with a full-time minimum wage job. Anyone who asked for it would be able to get one. This is envisaged essentially as a buffer stock of jobs that are available during a crisis to soak up the labour of the otherwise unemployed. But in other times it's described as a way to eliminate the Indigenous settler employment gap, which, as we know, is ongoing and long-term rather than episodic. And so it sort of has this dual nature that we can deduce. It's to be administered through local governments, and they would allocate job hosting functions to organisations within their communities. And as a essentially incentive and quid pro quo, it's at times described as involving the elimination of unemployment payments, because according to some of the authors, these will no longer be needed. It includes generous provision for employee on-costs and capital costs for the hosting organisations, and at times it's described in terms of being financed through monetary financing. And Bill Mitchell is well known as a leading scholar of modern monetary theory. This proposal mostly passes our 7 principles, although there's several points at which it fails to do so. In terms of ensuring a stable economic floor to alleviate poverty, the elimination of unemployment payments raises the question of what will happen to those who, for whatever reason, are unable to retain their job guaranteed job. Will there be a provision that they can be sacked? And if so, what happens to them then? These questions are largely unanswered. In terms of making suitable paid work available, there's also questions about the requirement that work be full-time, and whether that is going to align with the aspirations and interests of remote dwelling job seekers. And in terms of whether it ensures an adequate and flexible response to social fluidity, again, the proposals are unclear. So essentially, I've wanted to highlight these proposals for 2 reasons. One is to sort of demonstrate the way that these principles might be applied as a lens across proposals, to demonstrate areas where they, in our estimation, or in my estimation in this case, are likely to run into problems in remote Australia. And the second reason I've wanted to highlight these 3 proposals is really to demonstrate that there are a range of very different, but also very quite well developed and thought through proposals for the types of programs that might come after the CDP. So on that note, I'll pass to John Altman, who will talk a bit about the current government's proposals for what might come after the CDP, insofar as we know what they are. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francis. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri traditional owners down here in Melbourne. I'd also like to acknowledge that devising any new livelihood and work program for remote Indigenous Australia is going to be extremely challenging. Quite a few models have been tried in the past, and all have been judged failures by those in power. I'm not going to adjudicate on whether they've been right or wrong. I think my views are well documented in the literature. What I do want to note is that as the policy-making machinery slowly cranks along, there are about 40,000 jobless people currently on the community development program living in deep poverty. Chronologically, as described in our last seminar, as we as a small group of academics were working on developing a set of principles that might inform a new approach, the National Indigenous Australians Agency had a CDP task force working unilaterally on a law to pilot a new program that the Minister has unilaterally decided to call the Remote Engagement Program. The Social Security Legislation Amendment, Remote Engagement Program Bill 2021, let's call that mouthful the REP Bill, was tabled in the Parliament on 1 September 2021. Coincidentally, the day before we shared our discussion paper with a number of Indigenous and other stakeholders, as Zoe's timeline showed. The bill, in a nutshell, is about amending the Social Security Act to allow the payment of $100 to $190 per fortnight to an estimated 200 volunteers across 4 trial or pilot sites to encourage participation in 15 to 18 hours of work per week. It is intended that such engagement will allow upskilling and the inculcation of good workplace habits as a pathway to proper or mainstream employment. These trials that will be co-designed with the 4 selected community-based providers will be closely monitored and will cease on 30 June 2024, with volunteers only able to participate for a maximum of 104 weeks or 2 years. On that same day, 1 September 2021, a discussion paper called New Remote Engagement Program and dated August 2021 was also released. This discussion paper is seeking feedback on proposals by 30 November for a national remote engagement program that will begin in 2023. This is all pretty confusing, at least for me, as there are 2 parallel processes, 2 tiers of co-design currently underway. One part that I will focus on today is the immediate local pilot process that requires amendment to Social Security law. The other is a national co-design process that will run in 3 phases. A first current consultation phase to November 2021, a second phase from late 2021 to April 2022 that will focus on early learnings from the pilots, yet to be selected, co-designed and begun sometime soon, and a third and final consultation phase from July 2022 to the commencement of the new national program in 2023. I note that the term consultation is sometimes used interchangeably with co-design. The REP bill was immediately referred by the Senate Selection of Bills Committee to the Senate Community Affairs References Committee for inquiry because it was viewed as including, and I quote, significant policy matters impacting First Nations communities, including employment services, income support, mutual obligations, alternative employment models, end of quote, with submissions invited on 7 September 2021 and due by 20 September, and a report to be completed by 14th of October, last Thursday. The bill also attracted the attention of the Senate Standing Committee for the Scrutiny of Bills that reported on it on 16 September and of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights that also reported that day. All of this detail is contained in a very thorough, just released Bills Digest 23 from the Parliamentary Library, dated 15 October 2021. Now, I'm not running through all this legislative genealogy just to bore you all to slumber, but to highlight that this bill for 20 volunteers at 4 trial sites has already attracted a great deal of scrutiny. What I want to do today is as follows. First, I want to ponder why this bill is attracting so much attention. Second, I want to say a little about our invited submission to the Senate inquiry that we lodged, aiming to test the integrity of the REP bill against our very freshly minted 7 principles approach outlined by Zoe. Third, I want to briefly examine what the 14 other submissions to the Senate inquiry said. And finally, I conclude with some brief observations about policy making in this difficult area of remote engagement and where it might be heading. I note at the outset that the REP bill has generated an extraordinary archive of written material, including the transcript of a half a day of public hearing on 23rd September 2021 that I draw on, but that I can only deal with in a cursory manner today. So to the REP bill. At face value, the REP bill is not that controversial. It is proposed as one of several building blocks that will provide information to communities when co-designing the National Remote Engagement Program that will replace CDP. This building block builds an incentive payment of $100 to $190 a fortnight to see if jobless volunteers can be attracted to, and I quote, take on a placement to build their skills and experience and put them on a pathway to employment in the open labour market, end of quote. This payment will be on top of volunteers' social security entitlement and will not be income tested. It will allow volunteers to work 15 to 18 hours a week at award rates, but without other employment benefits. The range of payments is flexible at ministerial discretion, but is set quite low to ensure that the REP is not a destination. And at least at the pilot stage, it is limited to 2 years. As already noted, there are to be 4 trial regions out of 60, with none purportedly selected as yet, even though one actually is, to cover the diversity of remote and very remote situations across the 5 states and territories in which the Community Development Program currently operates. It is anticipated that there will be 200 volunteers, less than 1% of Community Development Program jobless of 30 to 40,000, and in no trial region will all volunteers constitute all jobless. So evaluation as promised could potentially occur within regions, volunteers versus others, as well as between regions, 4 trials compared to 56 non-trial regions. Our submission. In our submission, we examined the bill, its explanatory memorandum, ministerial press releases, and second reading speech, and assessed its provisions against the 7 principles Zoe has outlined. In the following table, which Zoe will put up, I summarise our assessment briefly. Just waiting, I think, for that next table. Oh, there it is. Whoops. Oh, sorry, that's it. Okay. We found that the proposed substance of the pilot would fail in all our criteria bar 1. And that's interesting, comparing that with the 3 models that Francis has just put up. On this basis, we recommended that the bill be rejected. We noted additionally that we doubted if the pilots could be properly evaluated in the time available and questioned if pilots were needed at all, given the plethora of information about past approaches, especially the CDP scheme, that are already available. And we noted that there were other live proposals, 3 of which Francis has looked at, that might provide better guidance than hurriedly implemented and likely highly contentious pilots. Other submissions. In my next slide, I provide a brief analysis of the 14 other submissions. And I apologise that this is a very busy slide that I will try and summarise as you look at it. Both the small number and preciseness of the submissions is understandable, given that invitations to submit were issued less than 2 weeks before they were due. I'll make a few summary observations. Most submissions wanted the bill rejected, and that's shown in red. One set of reasons was about process. The bill was not co-designed as required by the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, but pre-designed within the National Indigenous Australians Agency's Economic Policy and Program Division by its internal CDP task force. This pre-design did not engage with key Indigenous players and their proposals, especially the Fair Work Strong Communities scheme that's been with government for over 3 years. And then there was substance. The bill proposes to provide inadequate work conditions to volunteers that might breach their human rights. And the bill makes no provision for job creation, even at trial sites. Indeed, the REP Bill will introduce a new secondary labour market and trial sites, demoting those who work for the dole under the Community Development Program to a lower third-tier status. The relief that CDP was being abolished was palpable in all submissions. 4 submissions from providers did not reject the bill, in part because they wanted to leave options open to be trial sites, and in part because they saw benefit for their jobless to get at least some additional income support. The only keen promoter of the bill was the National Indigenous Australians Agency. I note, as a veteran submitted to parliamentary inquiries, an emerging trend for departments or agencies that have generated policy that is being examined to make submissions. They get a second bite at the cherry after being involved in drafting the bill, the explanatory memorandum, the media releases, and the second reading speech. I can see some benefit with having sponsoring agencies hauled in for public hearings after other witnesses have been heard for clarification and or responses. But the second go seems a little unnecessary. However, in this case, the National Indigenous Australians Agency submission was revelatory of the persistent and dominant ideology driving the pre-design of the bill. Diagram 1 in the NEA submission provided an illustration that shows a set of steps, a staircase to an imagined open labour market employment, a staircase up to an imagined open labour market employment incentivised by REP payments. This diagram is reminiscent of earlier assimilationist ladders to sameness, and a reminder that for Indigenous people, since the self-determination, all the steps in terms of labour market programs have been downwards. In 2 imagined case studies featuring Katie and Corey, we see 2 seamless imagined pipe dreams. Katie gains a work health and safety certificate and a heavy rigid vehicle licence and finds employment as a grader driver part-time with similar amount of money as other part-time workers, but dissimilar employment benefits that are not mentioned. And Corey, with considerable experience in the hospitality industry, who works as a food preparation assistant at an aged care home and childcare centre, is after 3 months miraculously offered ongoing full-time employment. In marked contrast to these imagined jobs nirvanas, Jobs Australia, a provider peak body, challenges the government to undertake a jobs audit in remote Australia to get a reality check on what is available. The Aboriginal Peak Organisation's Northern Territory identifies the need for 12,000 additional jobs, as Francis outlined, and we have been challenged to cost some options of meeting our principle for making suitable paid work available to all. 2 other brief comments. First, there's been no mention made on the role that income management might play in incentivising employment or disincentivising volunteering for the remote engagement program. We know jobs are the only way to escape the card. Will volunteering provide some reprieve? Second, the perspectives of those making inquiry submissions did not include Andrew Forrest's Minderoo Foundation, the Cape York Institute, the Woonan Foundation, the Centre for Independent Studies, and others who have historically championed the Community Development Program and demanded onerous mutual obligation requirements and strict penalties for non-compliance. But NEA, in its evidence, made it clear that their indirect representations and perspectives, especially for a jobs guarantee, remain in the mix as the new national remote engagement program is being co-designed. Let me conclude with 4 brief observations. First, in looking at the new lawmaking processes for the remote engagement program trials, I've been struck by the extraordinary level of paper fare, a term coined by Tess Lee, Kirsty Howie, and Justin O'Brien in 2018 in another context to refer to the administrative wars with paper that are endemic in Indigenous affairs. In this case, despite all the paper fare and submissions, the government majority Senate report made just one recommendation, that the bill be passed unaltered. The Greens put in a dissenting report opposing the bill. The ALP just made some dissenting noises. Second, the issue of co-design loomed large in debate about appropriate process. Co-design sounds good. It was referred to 81 times in the Senate inquiry report, but it is not as straightforward as it sounds. Some institution has to be the first mover. In this case, it was the National Indigenous Australians Agency, with its pre-design of the parameters of the Remote Engagement Program Bill. I'm reminded here of an observation by the late Bill Jonas nearly 30 years ago in 1992 at a CAEPR workshop. Indigenous communities are increasingly looking for negotiation, not consultation. And even back then, in 1992, negotiation was linked to questions of reconciliation and sovereignty. Third, what the REP bill proposes replicates some of the worst features of the now defunct CDP scheme. For example, providing award wages, but not proper award conditions, defining volunteers as unemployed, not employed, and providing no exit option into jobs. One of the key lessons that governments have overlooked is that it was CDP scheme workers who took up waged employment, either on a full-time or part-time basis, when it became available. The outstanding example being Aboriginal Rangers, who exited the CDP scheme to the Working on Country program when paid work became available from 2007. And just an aside, paradoxically, about half the Remote Engagement Program bill is about excising any mention of the CDP scheme from the Social Security Act, 6 years after its ultimate death on 1 July 2015, when the Community Development Program began. Finally, what is the way ahead? Clearly, in the process since May 2021, it is arguable if the National Indigenous Australians Agency could have made a worse start in looking to develop alternatives to the Community Development Program. As the first mover, it chose not to engage properly, instead choosing a very opaque process to frame the program. Why $100 to $190 per fortnight? Many on the CDP scheme earned more. Why 15 to 18 hours per week? Many on the CDP scheme worked more. What options for people where there is no formal work? It seems that the Australian government is caught in a deep path-dependent mindset that cannot think beyond a particular developmental mainstreaming approach that keeps recurring and failing, especially in remote Australia. We propose 7 principles that might counter such damaging myopia. We also propose diverse forms of alternate development that might be fit for purpose in 21st century Australia, that might be shaped by communities and all their diversity, and that might improve livelihoods through meaningful work. Thank you.